All right, welcome to Unit 1, Week 2 of U.S. History. This is going to be our quick overview. So what are we going to cover in this unit? We are going to be covering the causes, or in this week, sorry, we're going to be covering the causes of the American Revolution, the Revolutionary War, and the values that undergirded the revolution. So we are going to start by taking a look at a characterization of the American Revolution that might be kind of common in the way that people think about it. And it is as follows. In 1776, all the colonists rose up in unison to rebel against a tyrannical king and the horrible burden of unfair taxes the British had imposed upon them for over 100 years. During the long war that followed, citizen soldiers shivered in the cold, shared the hardships together, admired George Washington, and won the war single-handedly against the most powerful army in the world. So, is that true or is it not? Maybe there's some truth in there, but there's also a lot of exaggeration. And what I want to do with this first little mini lecture here is take a minute to maybe start to question some of the assumed information about the American Revolution. So we're going to tackle a couple of these issues. So the first question is, were the British really tyrants? Was it really tyrannical? Were the British actions really tyrannical against the colonies? And it's important to kind of consider the situation. So we're going to start with a couple of new terms. The first is mercantilism. And mercantilism is the kind of economy that the British wanted to run. And basically, mercantilism is the opposite of what we have now, which is a free trade sort of environment that we live in. In mercantilism, you don't want to do a whole lot of trade with other countries. You largely want to maintain self-sufficient, and you really, really don't want to have to spend your gold and silver on products from other countries. And so because of this, the British creating an empire where they could get goods from all over the place, be it India or the American colonies, was something that was very important to them. And so they could be trading with the American colonies, right? Getting cotton or tobacco or whatever, but it's all staying within the same British empire system. However, one of the problems, and we're going to come to this next term, salutary neglect, one of the problems was that the British wanted the benefits of empire, but they wanted to do it on the cheap. They didn't want to have to send a lot of soldiers or anything like that to keep up their empire. And so in America, throughout most of the 1700s, 1600s and 1700s, you had a policy that was known as salutary neglect. What salutary neglect means is that the British created laws, but then they neglected to enforce them. They did not enforce those laws. And so what happened was, as you can imagine, if people make rules, but then those rules are not enforced, the rules probably won't be followed. And so American colonists broke the rules all over the place, especially in relation to trade, right? To go back to this original point, mercantilism, the British wanted to keep everything within the system. Don't trade with outside groups. But the American colonists saw that they individually could make money by trading with the French, by trading with Caribbean island nations. And so they did. So they broke the rules. They veered away from that mercantilist system to benefit themselves. But again, the whole time, they were officially breaking the law. So in the 1760s, after the French and Indian War, which had cost a lot of money and which the British had fought on behalf of the American colonists, in fact, the British started to want to pay for it. They wanted to pay for that war. They thought it benefited the colonists, so they wanted the colonists to help pay. They needed to make sure that the agreements with Native Americans were upheld, and that would take some guarding as well, some money to pay for those soldiers to make sure that those agreements were upheld. So they started to tax the British, the British started to tax the colonists. And I think we're all familiar with the line, no taxation without representation. And that was true. The colonists had no representatives in Parliament where these taxes were made. But were the taxes really tyrannical? Were they so horrible that the colonists, were really suffering under them? Well, let's consider a couple of them. One of the taxes that's really discussed is the Sugar Act, as something that was horrible. But in fact, the Sugar Act cut taxes on sugar. What it did do is start enforcing the laws and cracking down on smugglers. So obviously, a lot of Americans didn't like that. What about the Stamp Act? The Stamp Act is also another act that a lot of people say, oh, it was so horrible. The taxes on printed goods went up, and the American colonists were under the yoke of oppression. Well, the fact is, after the Stamp Act was passed and there was massive protest among the American colonists, what did the British do? They repealed the Stamp Act. So a lot of the talk, while the notion of no taxation without representation was true, a lot of the talk about tyrannical taxes may be a bit overblown. All right, what about Americans rising up? Did all Americans rise up against this oppressive group? And the answer is not quite. So, or do they? Or do all Americans rise up? There's a very famous quote from John Adams who basically said 1/3 of Americans were for the revolution, 1/3 of Americans were against the revolution, and a third just didn't care one way or the other. They were not on either side. And that's probably not 100% true, but it's not 100% off the mark either. Especially in the early days, there was probably a good size, even a majority of Americans that either didn't care or were actively opposed to the revolution. Now that changed over time, but as the revolution started, it wasn't something that was a unanimous appeal. So that brings up the question of who was for it and who was against it. So there were a couple of groups that were for it. And let me walk through those. Sorry, let me find the right part of my notes. Here we go. So who was for the revolution? Smugglers, people that had been breaking the law for a long time were for it because obviously they benefited when the British government wasn't enforcing the law. They didn't like the fact that the British government began enforcing the law. There were planters who were for it as well for a couple of different reasons. One, a lot of planters owed a lot of debt to the English and English bankers, basically. And they thought this would be a way to get out of that debt. Planters were also facing pressure from ordinary farmers who wanted to move out into Indian land, and to support those ordinary farmers, they were for the revolution. And there were also some prospects that the royal governor, the governor appointed by, and this is especially in Virginia, but the governor appointed by the British government was going to start freeing slaves and taking actions that would be harmful for the planters. Another group that was for the revolution was legislators. So we talked about the House of Burgesses last week. So those colonial legislatures, those folks were the elite of the elite in the colonies. And they could only rise up so far because they were not in Great Britain, right? They could never have ultimate power in their colonies because Great Britain always had the last word. So these legislators wanted to have the last word. They wanted to be the most powerful group in their colonies. They couldn't do that with the British there. And then finally, many African Americans, slave and free, were for the revolution because of the discussion of the values: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and all men created equal. They thought there was a chance that that could apply to them. Who was against it? There were a variety of people that were against it. Royal office holders were against it because obviously their jobs came from the British government. There were also merchants who traded directly with England were against the revolution because that's how they made their money. These were, and it's important to note, these were the ones that were following the law, right? They were trading with Britain as the law said they should. That's how they made their money, and they didn't want to lose their income. So it was the ones breaking the law that were for the revolution, the ones that were following the law that were against it, which is important and interesting to note. Backcountry farmers of the lower South, so this is in like the Carolinas and Georgia, these folks were adamantly against the revolution. And why was that? Because their colonies that they were attached to treated them horribly. They were, we talk about no taxation without representation happening between the British and the colonies. We also had no taxation without representation happening within colonies. So these farmers way off in the west of these colonies, like Georgia and North Carolina, for example, were taxed, but they got none of the benefits of the tax. And they didn't have anyone in the colonial legislature to advocate for them. So they were taxed, but they got no roads, they got no bridges, they got nothing. And so they felt like the British were the ones that might protect them against these colonial legislatures that treated them so horribly. And then finally, Native Americans were obviously very opposed. The British had said that they would defend Native American territory, and the Americans clearly wanted to move west. And so they were adamantly opposed to the revolution. Okay, final slide here. David beats Goliath. One of the other myths about the American Revolution is that this group of plucky Americans with the spirit of revolution on their side and the vim and vigor to go and fight this biggest empire in the world did it out of pure grit, right? They defeated the British out of pure grit. Well, in fact, they did it with borrowed money and borrowed armies. So borrowed money, the Americans went into deep, deep debt to fight the revolution, borrowing money from Spain, from Holland, and from France. Could not have fought without that. And borrowed militaries. The French Navy was essential. It was incredibly important to the American Revolution. The Americans could not have won without the French army. The French Navy specifically blockaded the British out of certain ports where they would want to land their troops to fight the Americans. The French made it so that they couldn't do that. The French were essential to the American win. So these are just a few things to think about as we enter this week. Ways to complicate the story of the American Revolution. It's not quite the clean story that we like to tell all the time. There was a lot of intercolonial squabbling. There was a good number of people that were against the revolution. And again, it's important to note that some of the people that were most for the revolution were the ones that were used to breaking the law because they didn't like how the British law worked. That is it. Have a good one. See you next time.